Hello everyone, welcome to the new episode of Above Time. Today I am very happy to be joined by Alex to discuss about state crime with a focus on the state crime against democracies. And I'm particularly happy because I believe this is a very interesting and timely topic because of two reasons. One, on the second half of the episode we will focus on Israel and Palestine. So we will focus on the topic of genocide. And this is already very timely, and one might even think that it's already too late to discuss it. And second, we probably all see these reports about how people started to not to trust anymore the governments, the democracy is in decline, social inequalities are more and more obvious. We know that 1% of most of the countries hold more wealth than the rest half of the countries. And but this also impacts on how policies are shaped, how we hold our rights, from corruption to elections to basically to everything that impacts our daily lives. And this is why state crime against democracy, which will be explained by Alex immediately after I stop basically, is very, very important because I believe that it is not necessarily known by everyone. I think many people, when it comes to crime committed by states, are less prone to call it a crime, but more like a business as usual of a country. And now I will give you the floor, Alex, to introduce yourself briefly, and then we will start with the questions.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here. It's really great to get the chance to speak about state criminality, well, within and beyond democracies, outside of my usual work, and to do so in an environment that, allows the general public to have access to some of this, because I know that academia is very much exclusive in terms of the outputs that we're allowed, or rather encouraged, to put out there. I'm a criminologist. I'm a critical criminologist, if you will. I currently work as a postdoctoral researcher, and I have been researching state crime for about 10 years, 11 years now. It wasn't necessarily a choice. It wasn't what I had set out to do. I was an undergraduate student at the University of Portsmouth when I first encountered state crimes and state crimes against democracy. And I say encountered them not because they were in the curriculum, but because I actively experienced it. So this happened during the 2014 presidential elections for Romania. So for those who don't know, for the Romanian constitution, whenever there are presidential elections, as well as some other types of elections as well, the Romanian government essentially has a duty to ensure that all Romanian citizens, including those residing abroad, so have the ability to cast their vote. Now, how the Romanian government ensures that is, generally speaking, up to the government itself. But in that context, the voting itself in the Romanian diaspora was organized through polling stations. So we're not talking ballots, we're not talking electronic voting, we're not talking postal voting, but rather in-person voting. What happened when I managed to get to the polling station early in the morning on the first day of the elections was that I was met with very, very lengthy queues. And as we were queuing, and as the queues weren't really advancing in any shape or form, I found out from others that their friends voting in other countries, I was at the time in the UK, they were all encountering the same issues. And so naturally, the first reaction was like, okay, well, Romanian bureaucracy, what can you expect? This is exactly what happens. And then as the day progressed, and we continued queuing for another, I think, 10 hours, until the polling station actually shut, and some of us didn't manage to vote still. As the day progressed, suspicions were arising that perhaps this is not necessarily a case of just poor organizations, but rather that it was intentional. Intentional in the sense that at the time, the Prime Minister, which was also one of the main candidates to presidency, knew that the people living in the diaspora were more likely to vote for his opponent based on historical voting records. And so that gave me an idea of sort of looking into it a little bit further. And I was lucky that one of my lecturers at the time who was teaching this course on crimes of the powerful, I got in touch with him and he told me that there is this concept, the concept exists, of state crimes against democracy. It's at the time it was very under-researched, it was very underdeveloped. There were a couple of scholars in the United States that were doing research on state crimes against democracy, and they of course were doing it in the context of the United States, and oftentimes by reference to past events. And by past events I mean further back into the past. We were talking about the Watergate scandal, and that's the Iran-Contra affair and that sort of stuff. And so my lecturer encouraged me to pursue it. He was like, look, you've got a dissertation coming up. Why don't you make this your research? And that's exactly what I did. And that's sort of how I fell into this topic of state crimes against democracy, by deciding to then immediately start undertaking empirical research, contacting members of the Romanian diaspora that I'd found on Facebook groups, on Twitter, and talking to them about their experiences, and then also talking with various fractions of the political class to see what they thought about what had happened. And after that, it snowballed into researching state crimes against democracy at a global level. And again, here I'm talking about contemporary state crimes against democracy, and by reference to different democratic and political systems as well. Aside from that, I've also spent quite a bit of time researching or undertaking empirical research in matters of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. So, in other words, atrocity crime as an umbrella term.
Amazing. And I actually wanted to ask you about, because when I did a little bit research, I saw that you focused on this Romanian election, and I was intending to ask, so it's great that you put it out there. Well, I think you're also, I read your thesis partly, and I think it's a great research, but I think having a supportive, guiding professor is also very important. That's what I hear from your story, that he was encouraging you to pursue this, and I'm glad that he did.
Very grateful to him as well. I don't think anyone else would have been in the sort of mind frame to encourage something like this, especially when it comes to an undergraduate student, and especially when it comes with the sort of backlash that I faced after it from certain fractions of the Romanian political class, but also the media.
That's amazing. So you already started talking a little bit, so I will first ask, so we all have an idea on what is state crime. You can first explain this, but also then help us a little bit understanding where is the differentiation between state crime versus state crime against democracy.
So what we mean by state crime is, generally speaking, either actions or failures to act undertaken by state actors. And I'm going to explain later what we actually mean by state actors, that result in a breach of an obligation of the state, either under international law or under national law, and oftentimes obviously cause a degree of harm either to living things, be they citizens of the state or citizens of other states, or cause a degree of harm to other states, or cause a degree of harm to the environment. So that's kind of what we mean by state crime. Now, I used the term state actors or state agents. Given the complexity of the modern state apparatus, we can't really make the claim that the state acts in a coordinated way. It actually rarely does. Different state agencies and agents undertake different duties, and oftentimes there is no consistency and no prior agreement between what it is that they do. And so obviously we don't put that threshold or that requirement that the whole entirety of the state needs to be engaged in the commission of this crime when we refer to state crime. It could really be any fraction of the state. It could be an agency, it could be an organization, or it could be a state agent as an individual on their own undertaking this crime. Another thing that's important to note here is that, especially now, given the rise of privatization and the neoliberal power structures that exist within society, oftentimes crimes of the state are actually actively undertaken, in fact, by third parties, usually private businesses or individuals. Or private contractors, if you will. Again, we don't necessarily need the active engagement of a state agent, insofar as the state either encourages, sanctions, or tolerates the respective conduct that gives rise to this crime of the state. So now, in terms of the difference between, or rather the significant sort of differences between state crimes and state crimes against democracy. State crimes against democracy are, of course, a category of state crime. What differentiates them from other forms of state criminality is the fact that the harm is inflicted upon democracy, as understood as the people's ability to influence decision-making at the state level. Or, in other words, they harm popular sovereignty, as we understand it. Of course, the use of the word democracy here is meant to be reflective of what is harmed, but naturally, under criminal law, democracy cannot be a victim of a crime. And so, of course, it's also the case that the people are in fact victimized, but democracy merely represents that all-encompassing aspect of what the victimization is applied to.
Maybe help us understand more on how can we define this state crime against democracy even a bit more in detail, because as you said, there are now many more actors that are involved in the policy making, in global relations, we see it like even at COP, at the Conference of the Parties 2 weeks ago, there were many more lobbyists than actually like government officials. And I think this sort of blurs the line on how we can approach to this topic, because then in the lobbying world, there's obviously a lot of involvement in companies in policy making, and then there's a lot of states that have either big shares or smaller shares on certain companies. So then, is it only about this public administration being aware of these things, or because there is also this involvement of economically supporting them, allowing them to impact policies much more than any other actor around us, like civil societies or citizens themselves? So we can maybe try to explore a little bit more how we can really define this.
Okay, so when it comes to, I'm going to try to talk a little bit further about state crimes against democracy and what they actually are, and then I'm going to explain how this actually manifests, especially with the involvement of now third parties like businesses and companies. So again, here we're referring to both actions and omissions to act. So failures of the state to take action when something is needed of them in order to uphold democracy, right? These conducts or failures to act should, in order to qualify as state crimes against democracy, constitute a breach of this obligation that the state voluntarily took upon itself to protect democracy and to enable popular sovereignty from its citizens and residents. Now, this can take many, many forms, and all of them contribute in some shape or another to constitute state crimes against democracy. So, one category, for example, within this arena of state criminality against democracy is our attempts by the state to subvert either democratic institutions or democratic processes. So what we see there are, for example, where the states abuse their use of emergency powers in response to a crisis. We've seen that, for example, during the COVID pandemic, where oftentimes, yes, some of the measures undertaken by the state were indeed intended to protect, but others went well beyond this from infection or from the spreading of the virus and resulted in, military clashes in the context of peaceful protests or in the context of socially distanced protests. It resulted in attempts to censor the media or in the launching of strategic lawsuits against specific journalists. It resulted in attempts to oftentimes silence academics or suppress academic research. And so what we saw there is that this escalation that resulted in the violations of the rights to free speech, to freedom of expression, to association, then affected aspects of democratic participation. And so in that way, they constituted state crimes against democracy. Another example of attempts to subvert democratic institutions and democratic processes is, for example, electoral fraud. And perhaps this is one of the most obvious examples when one thinks about state crimes against democracy. Well, at least from my part of the world is. And so basically bribing voters to vote in a certain way, or bribing voters not to show up to vote with either money or with other necessary goods. We know that several states in Eastern and Southern Europe are dealing with increasing rates of poverty. And so when a particular political party or a particular political candidate is seen offering food or, at times it was medicine, at times it was construction materials to potential voters, especially when those voters have been previously failed by the state, we cannot expect them not to accept the bribe. Because in the long term, what they've seen is that the state is going to fail them either way. And so they might as well get what they can from the democratic process by engaging in whatever way is more opportunistic. We've also seen instances of voter intimidation and voter suppression as another manifestation of state crimes against democracy, where in the US, for example, many who had just recently acquired the citizenship during the last cycle of elections, for example, received threatening letters alleging voter fraud, for example. And so that dissuaded them from actually showing up to the polling stations in fear that this might lead to them experiencing certain legal troubles with state security forces, for example. We've also seen instances where states have attempted to suppress the media through censorship, suppress the civil society, by, again, through the use of state security forces, be it the military or police, in the context of protests, but also by actively launching attacks against NGOs and by targeting members of NGOs. We've also seen contexts in which the states have attempted to subvert democracy in other states through foreign interference, usually of an electoral kind, but oftentimes also it happens in different ways. And so all of these means can, of course, make use of third parties, businesses, companies, and it's more lucrative when they do make use of third parties, because then there's also the possibility of claiming that the state had no direct involvement in the crime itself, should the crime even come to light, although most often than not, they do not. So, for example, companies have previously been employed in suppressing voters, so actively intimidating voters through sending threatening letters, by, for example, also by engaging militias in personally sort of threatening certain categories or groups of voters so that they do not even attempt to show up to the polling station, let alone, vote in a certain way. We've seen, again, uses of organized criminal groups to assassinate certain political actors. We've seen organized criminal groups being employed in assassinating journalists as well, assassinating leaders in the civil society or in grassroots movements, and so on. Other arenas that we could potentially claim that we are sort of experiencing state crimes against democracy in as a result of a collusion between the state sector and the private sector is that with the increase of privatization in the past, 20 years or 30 years now, but even more so the accelerated increase of privatization in the past decade, what we've seen is that, of course, private businesses do not have the same responsibility and accountability to the public as a state would. The state's legitimacy rests on this idea that, they are intended to be representative of the people. And so should they fail to represent the people, what happens at a minimum is that they're not going to be re-elected in the next electoral cycle. Companies and private businesses do not need to meet this same threshold. They can, and some would argue, should be concerned about the ultimate goals, including, unfortunately, profit making. And so as public goods and public services increasingly become privatized, with obviously the consent of the state, what happens is that the people have fewer and fewer choices in terms of how their social services are provided and what those respective social services do for them as a community. And so indeed, some of the participants in my doctoral research on state crimes against democracy were actually claiming that this process of privatization that has been supported by the state is in itself a crime against democracy, because it had effectively taken away choices from the people in a very sort of opaque capacity. And I agree with that. I agree with that argument in many ways.
I see. While you were explaining and talking, I had like a million probably cases and instances in my mind that going around, and from that I'm not sure if I can count a single country between the democratic ones, the ones that hold democratic elections, etc., to their power, that does not commit state crime, which is very, very unfortunate, actually, from our perspective, because we have, at this point, very little power. And I think that's also another thing that maybe we can discuss, because so how do you, and you said that, and we talked before with you on how you conducted your study, and you used a framework that enabled you to talk to a lot of people and to get opinions from them. And I think that's very, very valuable, because it includes lived experiences. And maybe you can also briefly discuss about that. But I think I would like to also understand, and I also read on your thesis, so maybe I can lead it towards there as well. How does it impact for citizens to have more political awareness, more willingness, or more background to engage in political actions vis-a-vis state crime from happening, or the accountability of it? Does it impact that? Because now more and more I see that people, some do not want to even vote because they don't believe in it, because they don't believe in the state. But then I see that also leads towards more and more populist leaders to come into power, which will commit state crimes. So I think we enter in this like sort of a vicious circle that the less we participate, the more we encourage these crimes, and the more it actually erodes.
Yeah, so I think we are indeed observing increasing rates of disengagement with democratic processes. And by democratic processes, I mean anything from, yes, showing up to the polling station and voting, to writing letters to your local representatives, to showing up to a protest, to joining and actively participating in an NGO. This disengagement with democracy isn't new, but it has been sort of growing at alarming rates in the past decade, and perhaps even more so since the pandemic. And I think it was, at least to me, in many ways expected. People are currently dealing with a number of things, including experiencing conditions of life that are not always conducive to them finding the time or the mental space or the energy to engage in democratic processes. And so while, of course, disengagement with democracy isn't great, it can be understood. Of course, the people are apathetic if they feel like for the past few decades, really, they have been consistently let down by their elected representatives. There's inflation, there's, the effects of climate change, the fact that we are now experiencing meteorological conditions that pose a direct threat to our lives, but also to the integrity of, at times of our household. So it's, I think it's expected that there is a generalized sense of apathy. It's very difficult to make an argument for as to why people should be engaging, especially given the lack of evidence that political actors are responsive. We can vote, we can participate in citizens' assemblies, we can go to public consultations. But increasingly, what we see is that the loyalty of most representative governments lays with oftentimes the interests of the economic elites. Lobbying influences politics far more than we do through voting, through taking out to the streets and protesting, through writing letters, and so on. And so, it's just difficult to make this argument to tell someone that, after working 60 hours a week, they should take the time and, spend time online reading the right kind of news so that they are informed eventually about what is going on, so that they may adequately vote in the next electoral cycle. Now, that being said, I think as human beings, we all have a responsibility to protect those of us who are most vulnerable and most likely to be harmed by the actions or inactions of the state, whilst also being least likely to be able to influence politics in any shape or form. And that's sort of what I have been trying to do with my research on state crimes against democracy. And what I think should be done with respect to any research on state crimes. I don't think we can, as researchers or as academics, take it upon ourselves to say that we want to undertake an inquiry into crimes of the state through any other means, but by speaking through who are most affected by those crimes. If we don't amplify those voices, if we don't adequately seek to hear out their experiences and to also make sure that they travel further than would otherwise would in terms of their stories, then there's really no other way of looking into state crime that wouldn't reinforce the monopoly that the state already has on academics, on intellectuals, on the media, and on speech in general when it comes to its actions.
I completely agree on what you said about we can't expect people who work I don't know how many hours and have families, because we want now everyone to have families, because etc. to also be engaged, and as you said, in the right way, because right now you really need to have like a huge level of media literacy to find the truth, the real stories, that is not fake, that is not manipulated, and etc. And it is something that I always, when I talk to friends, that I bring, because I think we are all frustrated with the situation that we are in, and it is easy to blame other people that do not engage politically, that do not go to vote, that do not... writing a letter to your representative, it's already... That's not really happening, unfortunately. And it is very easy to be angry to those people, because it also diverts you from the real issue, from who we really need to focus. And I'm sorry, we cannot expect this. And if we are angry to this, maybe let's do something about it. But as you said, more and more things are being privatized. In many cases I can think of, I think in Western Europe, maybe not even in every country, but in some of them, public education is still okay. But I don't know. But in many countries, and mine included, more and more people who can afford take their kids to private schools. And then with the private schools getting more and more, there is less focus on public education to become better. And then this is what we raise the kids to become the adults that have to work for 60 hours or something, which is something that we discussed in the previous episode on the future of work or work in general. Do we allow the time for people to think? They don't. They are just tired. But then also not educated enough to know their rights, to know what can be a state crime, to know what a state should not do. So it is really not the responsibility of individuals that are being crushed under the system, basically. But then I can think of cases where people actually will not consider things that states do as crime, because towards each other, maybe we can easily see that this is crime or this is not. I mean, if someone steals something, we say, okay, you're a thief. Someone murders someone, okay, you're a murderer. But when a state does, I think a lot of people immediately, instinctively have the justification that a state does things to protect itself from the enemies or whatever. And we have this extreme empathy towards the state, or maybe fear of the power that it holds, that it is allowed to do anything they can do. So why do you think people sometimes think that states can do whatever they want and it is justifiable? And how can we overcome this?
This is not an easy answer because there are several forces that sort of interplay in leading up to the situation. But if we just take a step back and we look at the history of any state, modern or ancient, what we see is that state-sanctioned violence exists by default whenever a state exists. There is absolutely no example that anyone can bring about when thinking about states where a state hasn't applied an excessive use of force or violence to either its own people or peoples of other states. If we take a step a little bit further back, now, if we think about what we generally speaking consider to be a crime, I think most of us would agree that undue violence against people is bad and should be criminal. We can also probably agree that undue violence against property or the environment should also be criminal. What we see, however, is that once a state establishes its authority to any extent really over a geographical territory and the individuals that happen to be within that territory, that state will have essentially exclusive power to do all of the things that if any of us would do, would be criminal. It have the power to appropriate the property of people. I mean, I'm talking about taxation, but I'm also talking about, other practices through which states oftentimes gain access to, other material forms of property. It will have oftentimes the ability to appropriate the life of other people. There are still states, and quite a few of them, that practice the death penalty, for example, but even more so, or in a different way, that, have standing armies. The vast majority of states have standing armies, and the individuals who are part of those standing armies can lose their lives in the course of undertaking their duties. And of course, the state also has this ability to appropriate the freedom of people. And here I'm talking about practices like imprisonment, irrespectively of the context in which this imprisonment occurred. And this happens because states require a monopoly on force and a monopoly on violence as a means of sustaining their own existence and of maintaining the status quo. So we take it for granted that the state requires that monopoly on the use of force, on the legitimate use of force, on the legitimate use of violence, and on lawmaking in order to exist. There were a number of studies undertaken by psychologists that have seen that as individuals, we oftentimes come to justify actions of the state. I think one of these theories is called the system justification theory. And there's another one called, I think, the just world hypothesis. And what they're basically saying is oftentimes as individuals, we are prone to believe in a just world. We are prone to believe that things are the way they are, and the way that things are is justified by reference to some higher being or some higher entity. And so that leads to a situation where when we're presented with information that tells us that, well, actually the state isn't necessarily protecting you, or the state is actively doing things that harm you, as a matter of fact, we experience this thing called cognitive dissonance. We, in other words, don't necessarily know how to marry that belief that the world is just and the belief that the state is our protector, and the evidence that we're being presented with. And so a vast majority of people will react to that cognitive dissonance by simply deeming that evidence to be, a mistake, or the action of a single bad apple, rather than a coordinated action of the state. An exception, if you will. Or perhaps, and this is often something that we encounter, is that people will dismiss the evidence as a conspiracy theory. It's just a conspiracy. There's alternative explanations for this. And they will look and come up with those alternative explanations. These are all essentially protective mechanisms. They're protective mechanisms that have been established by the state as foundational to it, and that are being reinforced by the state through things like public discourse, through things like education, through things like form of socialization, through legislation. We learn very early in our lives what we are and aren't allowed to do on the basis of what the state thinks, or rather tells us that we can and cannot do. Crime is bad by default, and we don't question that. We do not question, the state's undertakings in criminalizing certain peoples, certain actions, certain groups. We just take that for granted as, a mechanism that is intended to protect us from others. And obviously that's actually very rarely the case.
Yes, unfortunately. I can totally see and understand that. It's also like a self-preservation.
Yes.
To think that. But I feel like nationalism also plays a role, which is also in itself a form of self-preservation, because you want to belong to this community and then protect each other somehow. And then in the name of nationality, in the name of self-defense or self-preservation, everything is all right. Everything can be justified. So, and in international law as well, states have the right to self-defense. Mm-hmm. So how do we then, but because I think that's itself a huge discussion and debate, because where do we draw the line, which we are seeing currently? But then how do we define the line between that self-defense, which here I'm talking, I think here there can be two ways. One, internally, because countries are not homogeneous, obviously, and there are certain minorities and certain, in many countries there is conflict between communities. So then how do we define between state crime and this self-defense or keeping the order within the country, which I think can go under the basically abuse of emergency power that countries may take. You also mentioned that state crime against democracy, but I think in general, state crime involves harm to the environment. How do we see this happening? Because also you mentioned on the climate change, etc., and there are a lot of cases where we see the impacts much later than on the time, and there is sometimes already past 2 generations or already 2-3 governments that have been changed. So then how do we define that? Whose crime is this? Because it's state, it's an entity, of course, but then there are political actors that are like the public administrators, etc., public servants that change throughout the time.
It's a complex question. It's a complex question because, as you've mentioned, it's very difficult to quantify environmental harm, and it's very difficult to quantify its effects as well. How long-lasting are they going to be? How many people are they actually going to de facto affect? What's the material damage caused? What's the, impact upon other forms of life, not human? And so we have still, although there has been progress in this arena, we still have very little ability to, again, quantify the amount of environmental harm, but also to perhaps pinpoint to the specific actions that have led to those harmful environmental conditions actually emerging. Oftentimes, the environmental harms that we experience, they're a combination of actions that have been undertaken over a long period of time, by, as you've said, different people, oftentimes in different areas as well, and with different implications. Now, what we do know for certain is that under international law, states have a responsibility to protect their citizens, their residents, and to protect the environment as part of that. In order to uphold this obligation for protections, what states necessarily need to do is, at the very minimum, ensure that they take preventive measures from causing known harms to the environment. There is already plenty of knowledge on the kinds of practices and the kinds of actions that result in environmental harms. And so what can be expected of states is to avoid, or if that isn't possible, if that would cause other potentially greater harms to the people, right, or to the environment, then if not avoid, reduce the involvement, their own involvement in these actions. Indeed, it's difficult to apply issues of criminal responsibility when it comes to environmental harms. It's difficult because, yes, this might be the case that, there have been changes in government, as you've said. This was done like 3 governments ago or 4 governments ago, and it's not an isolated incident either. It also overlapped with this other environmentally harmful thing that was done by this other state agency. And so how do you reconcile that? And my answer to that is that the focus, I think, in those circumstances should reconvene to the state, in the sense that, again, it is the state's obligation, so the current state agent's obligation, to address those harms, irrespectively of who specifically they've been caused by and when. And then, yes, we can think about potentially applying a sort of criminal sanctions to the respective people that were at the time in charge of decision-making, or who indeed should have been engaged in decision-making but failed to do so as a means to protect the environment. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I mean, as you said, it's a very, very complex, and I think it's a very hard to define, maybe even an issue, because so there are certain harms that have been done since centuries. We are not even talking about like 2-3 governments.
Yes,
there
exactly.
are some that has been deliberately done by governments in the name of economic benefit, which then which then can we say that which one is the more important one? Because I think these are all so abstract, because then you can claim that it was needed for the economic development of the region, etc., etc. I mean, these are all points that are already being used. Unfortunately, being and working in the climate policy, I can see that every single day, unfortunately. This comes from the energy policy to, I don't know, new infrastructure somewhere that you harm the biodiversity and etc. And I think it's very difficult because we don't know which one we put above. I mean, if you ask me, it is very obvious, but from the state and stakeholders' perspective, it is not. And I feel like this topic might come more and more as we see more and more the actual impact on what is happening, an actual impact where floods are taking lives and destroying not only like the infrastructure, the surroundings, but also the biodiversity itself, with the heat increasing, losing biodiversity, and this like rolling impact basically. But so far, no one really is responsible of it, and everything is business as usual. There are many, many cases where people or certain initiatives take certain businesses or sometimes the states to the court, but that is only being done in terms of maybe not starting that project or maybe seizing the project. But nothing is really being done to recuperate the harm done, which I'm not even sure if it can be done. It's really, really difficult. And another problem is that climate change really doesn't have a border. I think that makes it even more difficult. Not only that it's been like since centuries that the damage was done, but it's also beyond borders. So your answer, I think it makes sense because there is unfortunately not a defined answer. But thank you for that, because I think it's important that we talk also about it.
If I could just make a little addendum, there are some initiatives, and really there have been initiatives at the international level for a very long time to attract some form of criminal or legal responsibility of states or individuals within states for the commission of crimes against the environment. I think the first time it was perhaps in the early 70s when a group of Swedish lawyers, I believe, but also academics, proposed that there is a crime created in international law under the name of ecocide that looks specifically at this. Now, obviously, because international law is very much reliant on state collaboration and cooperation, the respective proposal was never really taken seriously. There were other priorities at the time, especially with the neoliberal and capitalist shift. Naturally, this was one of the many proposals that fell through. More recently, however, the International Criminal Court and the state parties to the International Criminal Court have been discussing the possibility of including the crime of ecocide in the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, essentially making it a fifth international crime alongside genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. And this would essentially seek to secure individual criminal responsibility, unfortunately. So we're not talking about state responsibility, but it will be applied to individuals within the state apparatus. And so there's some hope there. But of course, even in that case, that law will not be applied retrospectively. So we only have that, possibility that at some point, if this is adopted as part of the Rome Statute, then after that adoption and after the ratification by states, we might see a day when the environmental crimes committed thereafter might come under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, it's a wishful thinking, I would say, and I think we are all sort of working towards it. But I mean, considering our inability to react or resolve genocides even, let's see how ecocide if it will see the daylight. And speaking of it, I think it's the time that we also discuss this. And I think throughout the episode, we already have discussed what can constitute a state crime, what are these crimes, and what are the limitations to this. And now we can go a bit deeper and discuss how, and more case-specific, what is currently happening in Palestine and what is the state of Israel doing. What are the limitations and the explanations to it? Because although the International Court of Justice, I think there has been a lot of developments on that from the law perspective, but many member states are still unable to react. Let aside unable to react, they are actually contributing to it through economic support and military support, but also international support. And before I let you explain more from the perspective of your area, let's maybe go through the current statistical information that is not necessarily reflecting the reality. But today I just checked, and since the beginning of this war, but I would say genocide, because there is a whole history of what is happening between Israel and Palestine. Since 2023, 78,000 people were killed, and some reports even say that it is above 100,000. But we can't really know it because there is not enough transparency and accountability on it. And 90% of this number is civilians, and we all know that a lot of children and a lot of old people and women were killed. And 2 million...
yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. I think the newest report by the UN Inquiry Commission found out that maybe like 83% were civilians, I believe, and about 70% were women and children. When it comes to the victims of, yeah.
That is a huge number. And this is just those who were killed. I'm not even talking about the impacts on their families and etc., on the life expectancy because of the horrible conditions that people are living. But also 2 million people are replaced since this war began. So we are talking about a huge damage to people, to civilians, to the environment, to a lot of things actually are going on that.
I think it's very important to note, and I think you've mentioned this briefly, that this is not new. What we're seeing today is, Israel has not started committing state crimes in 2023. Not a reaction to the unfortunate attack by Hamas, but rather these violations in the Palestinian territories have been happening for decades, since the 40s really. I think it was in 48, right before the establishment of the State of Israel, that Zionist militias, others would, including myself, would call them terrorist groups, essentially eradicated about 750,000 Palestinians and then displaced 300,000 others to make room for Israeli settlements. And then since then, what we've seen that has happened in the occupied territories up to the point of October 7th, 2023, but also after it, is that territories have been illegally occupied, and this occupation is recognized as being illegal by the international community. They've been illegally annexed. There has been widespread unlawful use of force as a means to maintain this control over the respective territories. We've witnessed a very well established and very extensive apartheid system. We've seen an illegal blockade of Gaza, basically. And then we've seen widespread military attacks involving war crimes, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity that had essentially made these territories unlivable for Palestinians. Not to also mention the extensive environmental harm that was caused, that again has led to the loss of many natural resources that are otherwise necessary to life, right? So what we see in today's context is that all of these actions have primed the situation for the genocide that we're currently witnessing and that we have been witnessing for the past 2 years. So using that, defense of we're doing this to protect ourselves and our citizens is nonsensical. Under international law, the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. This right has been affirmed through numerous UN resolutions, starting with the early 70s and continuing through until 2024. And this right to self-determination of the Palestinian people also needs to be respected in the sense that it can be protected through resistance via all available means by those respective people. So when we're talking about crimes that an occupying power is undertaken against the local population, then that local population has a right under international law to protect itself, including through the use of armed force, if that is necessary. And in the case of Palestine, I think there is no doubt that it was. And so, as an occupying power, generally speaking, you cannot make the argument that you are doing something as a means of defending yourself. The defense that you need to undertake needs to be proportionate to the respective threat to yourself. The expectation in international law is that if an occupying power needs to defend itself, then it will retract from the occupied territories. That is the easiest form of defense. So to claim defense in the context in which you are the occupying power, in the international legal perspective, is absolutely nonsensical. It's, the same way in which, like, a bank robber doesn't have the right to defend itself from the police. It's, pretty much the same thing. Now, with respect to the international community, what we have seen in the context of, yes, the long-standing occupation of the Palestinian territories, but also the present genocide, is that states have not upheld their obligations in international law with respect to the Palestinian people or with respect to the Palestinian state. I'm going to try to sort of make this as straightforward as it can be, although international law is complex at the best of times, and I do realize we don't have days to discuss this. International law poses obligations on all states that are part of the international community to protect the right to self-determination and the right to freedom of people, irrespectively of whose citizens those people are or aren't. And so, in that sense, states have this obligation towards the Palestinian people to respect their freedom from apartheid, their freedom from genocide, and they also have obligations to the state of Palestine to respect principles of non-interference, of territorial integrity, of political independence, and of self-defense, right? When we are dealing with an occupying power. Now, under international law, states also have what is called a positive obligation to bring unlawful situations to an end, irrespectively of where they are being observed, although through lawful means, so obviously in line with the provisions of international law. And they also have a negative duty or negative obligation to essentially not recognize as lawful or legitimate a situation that essentially arises from the breach of international law. So in other words, in this context, they would have an obligation to not recognize as lawful the occupation of the Palestinian territories by Israel, right? And then, perhaps most importantly, states have the obligations to prevent certain international crimes and to refrain from aiding or assisting other states in the commission of those crimes. And obviously one of those crimes is genocide. Other crimes that come within this category are crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes of aggression, as well as other internationally wrongful acts that states can commit. The problem is that we have seen a system of complicity of states, where states not only have ignored their duties to seek to put an end to the crimes committed by Israel, but rather they have actively aided the Israeli government in the commission of these crimes through financial support, through military support. Especially the US, Germany, France, the UK. But they've also aided Israel by undertaking joint military training operations, for example. And this is the case of the Republic of Cyprus, as well as others. Now, under international law, these actions in the context in which they're occurring, are akin to essentially complicity in the commission of the crime of genocide. The government of, let's say, Germany, right, doesn't need to be actively involving its own military in the active killing of the Palestinian people, but rather it is sufficient that it contributes to it in a meaningful way by providing military aid or by providing military support. That still amounts to complicity insofar as it can be proven that the state has some acknowledgement of the actual or potential consequences and the intent of those consequences, which at this point, given how well documented this genocide is, it is undeniable that the state would have that knowledge. So we have a very interesting situation from an international legal perspective, where there is a relatively high number of states that are now effectively complicit in the commission of a genocide. From a criminal responsibility standpoint, and from a procedural standpoint, there's really no way of telling how this will go and where this will go, because again, the international legal system is very much reliant on state cooperation. I mean, there have been, arrest warrants for Israeli, the head of state, yes, but also other influential political and military leaders that have been issued by the International Criminal Court perhaps like a year ago. Given that the International Criminal Court has no police force of its own and no jurisdiction to carry out arrests, then it naturally is reliant on state collaboration for that. And the states that are friendly to Israel are simply not, undertaking their responsibilities under international law. And unfortunately, at this point, there is no punishment for a state for having failed to comply with an arrest warrant that is issued by the International Criminal Court.
Yeah. So not only that Israel is committing a genocide, so this is one of the biggest crimes basically against humanity, and committing these crimes in many ways, from torturing, from unlawful detention, from the way they treat prisoners, from using ways such as rape and etc. So it goes beyond and above everything.
Also famine, restricting access to goods that are necessary to life, but also to services that are necessary to life by destroying hospitals, for example, and actively targeting medical professionals in their killings. Yeah.
So it's tragic in a way that you can have this textbook of all the crimes that you can commit, and they are all being committed. So not only Israel does this, but almost majority of the states, I'm not sure if I can say majority because the democratic states actually that you would expect to be more accountable are complicit in this, and they are not only complicit through using public resources and public money, but also using the third actors, because we know that also for instance, from Francesca Albanese's report, how companies were also contributing to this, and these companies are mostly having huge deals and huge contracts with governments, which I mean, it's not about my opinion, but makes states complicit from that perspective as well, even if they were not providing military and direct economic support. I think that would make them in a way complicit. By using these public resources, actually, can we say that they are also committing crimes against democracy? Because maybe not in every state, and I would say maybe US would be one that is not very clear, but in many European states, public already express their, frustration with what is going on and with their state's inability to react to this. Can we state that states are committing this crime as well?
Yes,
vis-a-vis their
absolutely.
citizens?
Yeah, absolutely. From a number of standpoints. The one that you mentioned with respect to simply not being responsive to the requests of a citizenry that obviously wants them to stop, contributing actively or passively to the genocide. But also from the standpoint of, we've seen recently that in many democratic states, the government is now actively taking actions against those who do express support for Palestine. So we've seen that, for example, in the UK, a Palestinian support group has been designated as a terrorist organization. We've seen that the police actively arresting protesters of pro-Palestine protests. We've seen that many pro-Palestine NGOs have either had their funding restricted, or they have had their platforms restricted, or they have encountered sort of state-directed attacks on their headquarters or on their members. And so, yes, there's a series of state crimes against democracy that we can make the argument states are committing in relation to Israel's actions against Palestine and the Palestinian people.
Indeed. And I think this is also particularly more dangerous, and it's putting the Palestinian people aside because it's a genocide, and we discussed what other crimes are being committed. But we see that also many people are either desensitized to this or simply don't care or don't humanize Palestinians to even consider this as a genocide and etc. But this should particularly show those people that how states can absolutely violate every single international law, but also their national laws, because you have the right to protest, you have the right to express yourself, you have the right to a lot of things. But these are all being just overseen and violated in the name of staying and remaining complicit to this genocide, which I find very, very disturbing, because there is no safe place at that point for you to express yourself even. But I still believe it is very, very important that those who can and who have the privilege to express themselves. But maybe we should be aware of that, how this specific example can lead towards more and more violations. And I think this is not irrelevant from how we see the democracy going down and being, how can I say it, exhausted in a way, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. It's difficult to oftentimes conceptualize the possibilities of way in which people can resist state crime, or even the extent to which they even can. And I think one of the issues that has further negatively impacted this has been the adoption of neoliberal market ideologies. There's quite a bit of research that has found out that neoliberalism has essentially led to an empathy deficit through the promotion of individualism, through the promotion of competition, through the promotion of the achievement of material goals. And so that empathy deficit has certain effects. There's certain categories of effects, rather. The first is that, yes, we are going to find it more difficult to exercit empathy towards someone we don't necessarily identify with. And this, in this case, could be the Palestinian people, depending on who we're talking about. So that's one aspect of it, this inability to exercit empathy, especially towards those who are not seen as members of our in-group, right? The other effect is a lower likelihood that we are going to come together to collaborate towards the achievement of common goals, which is one of the most basic functions of democracy. It's one of the most basic things we are supposed to do as democratic citizens. We're supposed to engage in deliberation with each other to figure out what it is that we define as common good and how to achieve it, and then how to negotiate the conditions for the achievement of the common good and for the characteristics of the common good, to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind, or to make sure that no one is directly put at risk or harm because of the decisions that the majority makes. And so this combination obviously leads to a situation that looks very hopeless and very bleak, where there's plenty of disengagement from the civil society. In many contexts you can't even talk about a functional civil society to begin with. And simultaneously, there's a lack of interest in anything that doesn't happen to us or our nearest and dearest from a social characteristic standpoint. I mean,
indeed, and we have more opportunities to engage with each other, to see what kind of conditions others live or what is happening around the world. Yet we see this increase in lack of empathy, which I find it very interesting, because I can see today, I can watch it on my phone from social media, wide and clear what really is happening. Yet the system is encouraging me to choose not to focus on that and focus on my well-being and myself, which is actually a topic that I would like to discuss in another episode maybe, that this is such a perfect system. You're just pumping more and more well-being and focus on yourself and etc., while the world is literally burning. And I find it truly evil. And as you said, this is what the neoliberal capitalist system has brought to us, because I can just shut it down or change my algorithm and not see anything and just be happy and do my yoga and do my meditation. And that's it. That's a life that I live in a very connected world while being disconnected and individualistic. And with that, I would like to slowly come to an end. And it always happens, as I told you, if you remember, that it will obviously go beyond time. But I really enjoyed this episode. And
so
I think thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for joining. And I really hope that, as it happened to me throughout our discussions, that I was thinking from my countries, from Turkey to Romania to the one that I live in right now to the others, I could think of many, many, many violations of state crimes in general, but state crimes against democracy. And I think it's the first step for us to have this awareness, to have this even basic knowledge, to start seeing things happening around us and identifying them as what they are. And that will help us to maybe become more engaged or talk to other people or basically have this thinking. Even I think it is already very valuable to think about it for us to become more engaged politically. So thank you so much again, Alex. And thank you so much to the listeners for being with us in this long episode. And see you next time.